Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 114. Round 1. The week leading up to the sports festival slipped away like sand between his fingers. He knew Eraser had started to notice the way they lingered at the end of patrol every night, but he hadn't said anything about it yet. Ivy still had a little over a week, and it seemed like neither they nor Eraser wanted to waste that time thinking about how little of it they had left, which was probably for the best. Nonetheless, every night that they sat in front of their mirror and scrubbed off their eyeshadow hurt a little more than the last. The morning of the sports festival was tumultuous. He forced himself to eat a full breakfast, even though every bite felt like it was going to force its way back up his throat from the nerves. All Might had told him that this was his chance to tell the world what he was made of. He was going to have billions of eyes on him. He couldn't mess this up. He had spent most of his time writing his speech. Ida and Uraraka had invited him to train after school, and he probably should have taken them up on the offer, especially to work on his speed with Ida, but his brain had convinced him that if he didn't spend every waking moment he had staring at the speech he had written out and changing one bit of punctuation back and forth for hours on end, he was going to make a fool of himself on international television. It was stupid. It was a spoken speech. His punctuation didn't really matter, and he had long since passed the point where he was still fiddling around with word choice. The speech was done. It was as good as it was going to get. But he still spent a full 4 days staring at the page for no reason at all. The paper he had folded up in his pocket looked like he'd been carrying it around for years because he had been nervously unfolding, rereading it, and refolding it over and over again, even though he already had it memorized. He was doing his best to not slip it out of his pocket for the third time in the last 15 minutes when a boy from his class came up to him. Midoriya. He called his attention up from the speech, burning a hole in his pocket. Yeah, Todoroki, what's up? He sputtered out nervously. With everything that had been going on, he hadn't had the time to size up most of his classmates, but he knew who the legacy kids were, and Todoroki was one of the ones who had gotten in on recommendation. He was Endeavor's son. From an objective standpoint, you and I are the strongest in the class, he stated bluntly. Izuku had yet to hear the boy speak unless spoken to, and honestly he had been concerned about that, but he was starting to see why that was the case. He was worse than Eraser. Would it kill them to beat around the bush just a little bit? All he had to say to that was a nonsense string of consonants. You have All Might in your corner. Don't think I haven't noticed, he continued. Oh, Kami. The whole class was watching them. The waiting room was dead silent, aside from whatever the hell this conversation was. He could only be consumed by panic over so many things at a time. What? Don't. I'm still going to beat you. Todoroki cut off his flimsy denials. He didn't have a response to that. How was he supposed to respond to that? Why was this, of all things, what broke Todoroki's apparent vow of silence? Did his father put him up to this? It's no secret that Endeavor was not happy sitting in his number 2 spot for over a decade now. He had beef with All Might, and he was not good at hiding it. Izuku had the sneaking suspicion, after seeing Todoroki's ice powers, that Endeavor was trying to create progeny for the sole purpose of creating something stronger than he could be, and this was not doing much to assuage his concerns. Did Todoroki even want to be here? By the time he had put a cap on his internal crisis, Todoroki had already walked away, and Kirishima was berating him for his hostility. One crisis at a time, Izuku. One crisis at a time. He ignored the class's reactions and started reciting his speech in his head for the millionth time. A speech that was going to feel a little pointed after Todoroki's declaration of war. Oh, damn it. Well, it was too late to change it now. He squinted against the light of the sun as he made his way onto the field with the rest of his class. Mike was announcing all of the classes, but it was just static in his ears. He was so nervous. He doesn't think he really took in anything anyone was saying until midnight called him up for his speech. For the student pledge, we have Izuku Midoriya, she announced with a dramatic flair. How the hell did Eraser end up with two of the most dramatic teachers at UA being his closest friends? Whatever. That wasn't something he needed to concern himself with right now. Right now, he needed to focus on walking up the 3 steps leading up to the stage without tripping. Just one foot in front of the other, super easy. He's great at using stairs and walking normally on flat surfaces. He's been doing it for years. He walked up to the mic without incident and took a deep breath before he grabbed it. It gave out a little shriek of feedback, which he cringed at, before he brought it toward his face. This was it. He can do this. It's only 4 sentences. He's got this. He steeled his nerves and did his best to maintain a relatively neutral expression as he spoke. I am here on behalf of my classmates to say that today may be about competition, but heroics is about cooperation. There are enough things in the world that separate us: age, gender, race, class, quirks, or lack thereof. His words caught on that last part, but he continued like nothing had happened. The list goes on, so I want to focus on what brings us together. No matter who wins, no matter their quirk, gender, or class, is a part of the UA community. I don't want anyone to lose sight of the fact that we are in this together. That being said, I expect everyone to do their best, to go above and beyond. He concluded his speech and held the microphone up for the crowd to finish. Plus Ultra! Oh, call me. Oh, gosh. Oh, frick. Oh, he did it. He's done. He's walking down the stairs, and he's not tripping over his feet, and he's done. His heart rate was surely visible against his throat if anyone looked closely enough, but aside from that, he thinks he did pretty good. At the very least, no one was laughing at him, and Mike was already trying to quiet the crowd for midnight to announce the first round. He had his hands balled into fists in an attempt to hide their shaking when Kirishima slapped him on the back, dang near causing him to fall on his face. Zero caught him before he actually fell, and everyone was laughing in good nature, or at least he hoped they were. He was still too panicked to understand a word anyone was saying to him, so he just smiled and nodded. Uraraka shot him a thumbs up, though, so it was probably fine. Midoriya was peculiar. Shota had seen him fiddling around with the speech he'd prepared before he had confronted him at all, so he didn't think that was aimed at him. But there was no way to be sure. He could have changed it last minute as a subtle jab, though his gut told him that wasn't the case. Midoriya had been the one on the front lines at the USJ. He had been the one to step up and protect them after their teachers had been taken down. Shoto didn't know exactly what he had done, but he knew that he had been severely injured. He hadn't asked anyone, but he couldn't help but overhear his classmates. Asui had insisted that Aizawa-sensei, at the very least, would have been dead if not for Midoriya. Perhaps he had been subconsciously blaming his peer for the beratings he had been receiving at home for not having been on the front lines of the fight as well. He had done his best to be there, but he was too slow, and by the time he had shown up, All Might had taken care of it. His father wasn't pleased by that. Shota had told him as little information as he could get away with, but he couldn't deny that he was too slow and All Might had been the one to save them all in the end. The rivalry he had just started between himself and Midoriya reminded him too much of his father's poor social grace when it came to All Might. They hadn't even started the festival yet, but he already felt like a sore loser. Pride wasn't something he thought he had a problem with. But as the crowd roared in approval for Midoriya's speech, he realized maybe he was more like his father than he thought. The idea brought a sour taste to his tongue, one far more bitter than his wounded pride did. Shota was cursing the kid more and more each day for forfeiting his role as class president. That speech was perfect, short and sweet, and it painted him in a good light. It showed him as compassionate and thoughtful, and he hardly stumbled over his words in the slightest. I think you were right about him, Sho. Poor kid doesn't know his own worth, Hizashi remarked after handing announcements over to Numori. I showed you his battle. I showed you the battle trials. You know I'm right, he replied. And you're so humble about it, too. They shot back sardonically. I'm going to offer him an internship as well. I want to keep an eye on him, they added when he rolled his eyes in response. What are the chances he accepts either of us? He asked in a tone that said he was fully expecting their offers to be denied. Probably low. I doubt he's going to have a lack of choices, and he's already fed up with our prying into his home life, if his reaction from the hospital is anything to go by. Hizashi agreed ruefully. The meeting with his mother is before internship choices are due, isn't it? He reminded them. Exactly. Doubt he's going to want anything to do with any of the teachers here after that. Hizashi agreed again. Yagi still seems to be in his good graces, he pointed out. Hizashi made a face like he had something to say about that, but he cut himself off and raised his hand, signaling for silence as announcements were tossed back to him. You kiddos ready to run? They asked theatrically before the countdown buzzers started to tick down. 3, 2, 1, begin! Izuku barely even computed the words obstacle course before the starting buzzer sounded, and he realized he was at the back of the pack. He heard a cry of alarm start at the front of the crowd in the tunnel, start to make its way toward the back, but he couldn't see what was going on. Due to the fact that he couldn't see the threat, he assumed it had to be below his field of vision. His suspicions were confirmed when he saw the fast approaching sheet of ice taking hold of everyone's feet. He jumped on instinct and found himself standing on top of the ice rather than stuck in it, but he was still surrounded by a crowd of people who were stuck in place. There was only one path out of here, and he felt awful about it. He pulled himself up by the shoulders of the two people next to him and started using the crowd as stepping stones. He aimed for the sturdiest looking shoulders and he shot apologies back with each step, but he still felt like a prick. Thankfully, he was out of the tunnel shortly and facing down robots from the entrance exam, which was much more preferable than facing down his peers. He was ahead of the vast majority of the pack and thus was granted a front row seat to Todoroki setting off another massive ice attack. The ground shook with it as ice formed around him like an explosion. Crystals tall enough to bury the 150-foot tall robots formed at his command, and frozen air flowed out from where Todoroki stood at the epicenter. It damn near knocked the air out of his lungs. That was powerful. Izuku had seen the careful control he was capable of in the battle trials. The scope of that attack was already impressive, but this was a whole other beast. He stood there in wonder for a moment before he heard other contestants rushing toward the path Todoroki had made for himself. The tower of crackling ice and creaking metal ahead of him wasn't going to hold, and for a moment in his mind's eye, he saw his classmates' blood strewn across the ground under the carnage left by these behemoths. He froze them off balance! They're gonna fall! He tried to warn them. The people closest to him hesitated, but those who had already charged ahead either couldn't hear his warning or were too caught up in their lead to care. With his heart in his throat, he activated One for All and ran as fast as he could toward one of the students ahead of him. They weren't going to make it through the gap before it all came tumbling down. He grabbed them blindly as debris was starting to cloud his vision. Tiny crystals of ice fell from the wreckage like snow, and all he could see was light peeking through the darkness, and he hoped to heaven that the light meant the other side of these robots. He managed to grab one more person-shaped blob before he made his way to the other side. The three of them sprawled out on the ground as a messy huddle, and Izuku's heart had yet to start beating properly until he heard Mike's voice booming out of the arena's speakers. Looks like one of our hero students took some passengers along for the ride. 4 people have made it past the pileup. How is everyone else going to get through? They exclaimed theatrically. It was a game. This was a game. Come. This was just like the entrance exam again. No one was in any real danger. Why couldn't he get that through his thick skull? A hero student from the other class that Izuku didn't recognize gave him a quick glance and a grateful head nod before he took off again, and the business student, Izuku assumed, was still sitting there with wide eyes. You're fine. Let's go, Izuku insisted, dragging them up to their feet before brushing himself off and charging ahead. This wasn't a team sport. It was probably a good idea for him to be seen helping someone like that. It was good publicity, but he couldn't stick around and let them hold him back. They were going to be fine, but he wasn't going to be fine if he sat there and let everyone else pass him by. He avoided the rest of the robots, letting others waste their time taking them down, and charged ahead. The next obstacle actually almost had him laughing. He had to jump from one tall, narrow surface to another. The only way this could be more in his wheelhouse is if whoever made this course asked him personally for ideas. He paused for a second to assess the easiest path forward and wasted no more time charging ahead. It wasn't often that he had to use wires to get from building to building. Generally, he tried to avoid them because he didn't want to break anything and shut the power off to half the district, because Kami knew the government would take its sweet time sending someone out to fix anything in Uptown. But sometimes it was his only option. The steel wires were much more stable than the flimsy phone lines around Uptown. They didn't wiggle around beneath his weight nearly as much, and he had no problem crossing the chasm below. However, by the time he made it to the next obstacle, he could hear the telltale sound of explosions up above. There was an open field in front of him with huge billboards off to the side warning him about the mines buried beneath the dirt. He could see the subtle variations in the terrain where the earth had been disturbed. It wasn't too difficult to maneuver around them, but Kachan was closing in. Right now, he was in second, close behind Todoroki, but he knew Kachan wasn't just going to pass him. He was going to do his best to make sure there was no chance for him to overtake him again. Todoroki was making his way carefully through the minefield, and he had yet to make a misstep. He was about a quarter of the way through, and Izuku was closing the distance pretty rapidly, though not as rapidly as Kachan. He was going to blow him up as he passed. Izuku knew he was. All he could do was brace for impact. Just as he expected, Kachan sent an explosion right for him, and the shockwave set off several of the mines around him as well. Kachan's blast blew through the forearms of his shirt because he had used them to cover his head, but the other explosions didn't do anything but shove him off balance. So, shockwaves set off the mines. He could make a shockwave. He could make a very big shockwave, actually. One big enough to break him and everything else within range, though that wasn't exactly what he was aiming for right now. He thought of the way Todoroki had shown off such a massive display of power at the beginning of the race. That was good publicity. Izuku could do that too. He had All Might's quirk, for heaven's sake. He could show off, couldn't he? He couldn't risk his legs. He needed to be able to run, but he could risk an arm, right? This was a bad idea. But it was now or never. The rest of the competition was closing in, and he wasn't going to be able to pull off a large attack like this if people got too close. If he could sink a boat without breaking his arm, then he could make the ground shake a little, surely. Without giving it too much thought, he gave his surroundings a quick once-over to make sure Hagakure or someone else with a stealth quirk wasn't sneaking about, and brought his fist down onto the ground like a gavel. The earth around him shook like there had been an earthquake, and the mines everywhere started going off like dominoes falling away from him. Izuku dashed after the shockwave, taking care to make sure that he didn't outrun it and find himself in the midst of all the explosions he'd just set off. He couldn't see much of anything through the smoke and dust kicked up by the mines, but he heard shouting up ahead, so he assumed Todoroki and Kacchan had just gotten caught up in his trap. He needed to book it now when they were distracted. He could imagine the green light crackling off of him would give away his location as it bounced off the dust particles in the air. So he gave the shouting as wide of a berth as he could and kept running until he could see where he was going. As he burst out of the cloud, he saw the finish line. Wait, the finish line? He didn't let himself second guess things for too long because explosions had started going off again, and he knew that was Kacchan getting his wits about himself. His feet pounded against the dirt as he sprinted across the finish line and back into the arena. He could see himself on the Jumbotron, and Mike's voice coming through the speakers reminded him that he was live. So he plastered an ear-to-ear grin on his face and did his best to catch his breath through it. Holy crap, he just got first place. And billions of people were looking at a close-up of his face on their TVs right now. That was fine. He was all too relieved to see the cameras cut to Todoroki and Bakugo coming in right behind him at second and third. He kept his eyes aimed up at the screen just in case the cameras cut back to him, and even though he was no longer in frame, he could tell that the angry look on Bakugo's face was aimed at him. Kacchan and everyone else in the competition were going to have their eyes on him in the next round. Them, along with the several billion people watching at home. This was an absolute nightmare. He tried to remind himself that this is what he wanted. He wanted everyone's eyes to be on him. He wanted to make a name for himself. But it didn't quell his anxieties in the slightest. Up in the teacher's booth, he could see All Might looking back down at him with a smile so wide, Izuku worried he was about to blow his cover. He had made him proud. The thought brought a more genuine smile to his face. He did well. He was going to have a target on his head in the next round for sure, but he did well. Midoriya! Uraraka came running up to him, panting. That was amazing! I can't believe you got first place. I'm so jealous. He turned into a blushing mess despite himself and held back denials that he did anything worth note because he didn't want to offend her. Thanks for blowing up all those mines. That would have been a real pain in the butt if you hadn't, she added with an out-of-breath laugh. Oh, yeah, no problem. He returned awkwardly, still catching his breath as well. It wasn't until Medbot swarmed around him and he looked down at his arms that he realized that he might have messed up. You just sprained your wrist, Sonny. It's not that bad, and the burns are mild. You're going to be fine, Recovery Girl assured him. He could tell she still had something to say, so he waited patiently and raised his eyebrow in silent question when she didn't go on. I told you before that injuring yourself is going to have lasting effects. Even if I heal you, you're left with a scar, whether internal or external, and that scar tissue is going to build up. Every time I heal you, you lose more of yourself to scar tissue, and that is going to impact your mobility. I'm sure it's already causing you pain, though that hardly seems to deter you from making the choices you make, she said a little more harshly than he had expected. This is just a game, dearie. Don't maim yourself for it, she concluded, sounding resigned but not unkind. He couldn't help but feel like he had disappointed her. You're doing better, boy. Don't look so glum, she chastised as she tossed him an energy gummy. He instinctively caught it with his right hand, the one that had yet to be healed from its sprain, and Recovery Girl looked at him in exasperation. He sheepishly transferred it from his right hand to his left before bringing it to his mouth to take a bite out of it. Recovery Girl just shook her head and continued rummaging around the cabinets as she had been earlier. You have an hour before the next round starts. Get as much rest as you can, she advised as she walked over and pecked him on the forehead. The pain he had yet to fully register faded away, and an exhaustion that he was all too familiar with replaced it. He finished chewing on the gummy she had given him and let himself melt back into the cot. He didn't expect to sleep, but it wouldn't hurt to try. End of chapter.